10 years is a long time to listen to everything and pretend to hear nothing. Sarah had become very good at it. The watching was the hardest part in the beginning, learning to track conversations through peripheral vision, reading lips well enough to follow a room without turning her head, understanding the specific quality of silence that meant someone was speaking directly at her, so she could arrange her expression into the appropriate blankness before they made contact. She had practiced in front of mirrors for 3 months before she felt confident enough to take the performance into public. By the end of the first year, it had become reflex. By the end of the third, it had become, in some strange way she could not entirely examine, simply who she was. She had been 18 when she made the decision, old enough to understand what she was choosing, and young enough to believe the choosing would be straightforward. It had not been straightforward. Nothing that lasts 10 years ever is. She was the only daughter of Lord Brennan of House Callum, a middle house of the Western Territories with enough standing to be summoned to court functions, and enough sense to know that standing was fragile. Her father was a careful man, a political man, a man who understood that a daughter represented an opportunity, and an opportunity represented an alliance, and an alliance represented survival in a court climate that rewarded connection and punished isolation. He had been managing Sarah toward a strategic match since her 15th birthday, with the patient systematic efficiency of someone tending a long-term investment. She had understood this. She had not resented it exactly. Her father was not cruel. He simply had a particular way of seeing the world that left very little room for the possibility that his daughter might have her own way of seeing it. What she had resented was the bond. She had felt it for the first time at 18, at a border court gathering that her father had brought her to specifically because the young Lord of House Marin would be present, and Lord Brennan had reason to believe the man was looking for a match. The young Lord of House Marin had been pleasant enough, reasonable-looking, politically well-situated, with the kind of easy confidence that came from having been told since birth that he was exactly what he appeared to be. She had shaken his hand and felt nothing. She had crossed the room 40 minutes later to accept a drink from a servant, and the servant had glanced up, and the bond had hit her like a bell struck from inside her own chest. The servant was not a servant. She understood this immediately, and with the cold clarity of someone whose instincts were very good. He was too composed, too aware, positioned at exactly the angle that gave him sight lines across the entire room without appearing to surveil it. His clothes were simple, but his bearing was not. He was watching the gathering with the focused attention of someone responsible for it, rather than employed by it. She had taken her drink and walked away, and spent the rest of the evening in the careful management of her own expression, which was something she was already practiced at. She had asked questions afterward, quietly, indirectly, in the patient way she had learned to gather information without appearing to gather it. She had identified the man within a week. Prince Aldrich, second in line to the throne of Valdenmoor, conducting an informal survey of the western border territories under a cover identity that was apparently convincing enough for most rooms but had not been convincing enough for her, which told her things about both of them that she had needed time to consider. She had considered for 2 months. She had thought about the bond, what it meant, what it would mean, the specific shape of a future where she was bound to a prince who would one day be king, where every decision about her life would be made at the intersection of her feelings and the kingdom's needs, where she would spend her years being managed by forces larger than herself, with considerably more efficiency than even her father had managed it. She thought about her father's careful political calculations, and she thought about the court she had observed, and she thought about every woman she had ever seen in the position of royal mate, the specific quality of their smiles, the managed brightness of their eyes, the way they occupied space as if they were always aware of being watched. She thought about all of it very carefully, and she made her decision. She had found the documentation herself. Mating law had provisions, specific, formal, legally binding provisions that exempted individuals with sensory impairments from the standard bond obligations. A deaf individual could not be compelled to acknowledge or complete a mating bond. The law was old, written in an era when such impairments were poorly understood, but it had never been repealed, and Sarah had read it 4 times in 4 different legal volumes to make certain she understood it correctly. She understood it correctly. She told her father she had lost her hearing in a fever. The fever had been real. She had been genuinely ill the previous autumn, and the timing, while not perfect, was plausible enough for a man who was not looking for reasons to doubt her. Her father had been devastated in the way of a man watching an investment lose value. She had managed his devastation with careful sympathy. She had learned to speak with the specific flatness of someone who could not hear their own voice. She had learned the hand language used by the deaf community of the Western Territories, had engaged a tutor discreetly, and learned it properly, so that when her father hired a specialist to communicate with her, she could receive and respond with the fluency of someone for whom this was not new. She had been very thorough. She had always been thorough. And for 10 years she had listened to everything. The royal summons arrived on a Tuesday in the 10th year. She read it at the breakfast table, while her father watched her face for a reaction she was careful not to give. The document was formal and unambiguous. Every unmated female of noble blood between the ages of 18 and 28 was commanded to present herself at the royal capital within the month. The Alpha King of Valdenmoor was selecting a queen. She set the summons down and looked at her father, who was already composing the hand-signed explanation he would give her, which she watched with the patient attention she had given every signed conversation for 10 years, performing comprehension at the appropriate pace, performing the appropriate responses, a performance so practiced it required almost no conscious effort anymore. The problem was not the summons. Summonses could be managed. She had been managing situations for 10 years, and she was very good at it. The problem was that she knew who the Alpha King was. Prince Aldrich of 10 years ago was King Aldrich now, as she had followed from a careful distance through official records and court dispatches that her father received, and left unattended on his desk when he forgot she could read. She knew his reign, 3 years, considered strong by most measures, a man who had apparently brought the same focused intelligence to governance that he had brought to standing unobserved in a room full of people. She knew he had not yet taken a queen, which she had noted and not examined too closely. She knew he had been conducting the selection process for 8 months with, according to her father's correspondence, surprising seriousness, personally reviewing candidates rather than delegating, asking specific questions about character and capability rather than the standard assessments of bloodline and beauty. She had thought about this for 8 months. She had told herself it was information, not relevance. The bond was still there. This was the part she had not anticipated fully when she was 18 and making calculations. She had understood that the bond, once felt, did not simply disappear because she had decided not to acknowledge it. She had understood it would remain, present, patient, an awareness she had learned to manage the same way she managed everything, through attention and discipline and the steady application of will. She had not fully understood how it would feel after 10 years of managing it. The specific quality of a connection held at arm's length for a decade, neither released nor fulfilled. Not painful, precisely. Something more like the particular ache of a note sustained beyond its natural duration, present and present and present, just below the threshold of what she allowed herself to feel. She was 28 now. Her father was older and his health had begun to decline, and the Western estate was well managed largely by her invisible hand, which she conducted through a careful system of written notes and strategic incompetence performed by the steward who knew the truth and was loyal and well paid. She had built herself a life of considerable competence and near total isolation, and she was, most days, satisfied with it. Most days. She had 4 weeks to decide whether to go. She decided on the first day, and spent the next 3 weeks pretending to herself that she was still deliberating. She told her father she was willing to attend. She watched his relief, careful and well-managed beneath appropriate paternal concern. She packed her own trunk, as she always did, choosing practical clothes over court dress, and she settled into the carriage for the 3-day journey to the capital, with a leather volume of Western land law open on her lap and the clear-eyed awareness of someone walking into a situation they have prepared for and still cannot fully predict. She had prepared for many things. She had prepared for the court's reaction to her impairment, which she had navigated before and could navigate again. She had prepared for the selection process, having read every available account of similar royal proceedings. She had prepared for the possibility of being declined on grounds of her hearing, which was legally protected territory, but which practical reality sometimes overrode. She had not prepared for him. She had told herself she had. She had been telling herself she had for 10 years. The carriage arrived at the capital on a Wednesday morning, and she stepped out into the pale morning air, and the capital arranged itself around her, enormous and detailed, and very loud, none of which she was required to perform deafness toward, because the deafness was for people, not places, and she had always been careful about that distinction. She stood in the courtyard and breathed the capital air and felt, just below the managed surface of her composure, the bond stir like something that has been waiting patiently for exactly this and has chosen not to say so until now. She picked up her traveling case and went inside. The receiving hall was full of women. She had known it would be, and the knowing had not entirely prepared her for the specific texture of it. 43 women in varying states of elegant preparedness, representing every significant noble house in Valdenmoor, filling the long hall with the particular energy of a room where everyone is performing composure and no one is feeling it. Sarah moved to the position the receiving steward directed her toward, which required a written card from the steward rather than verbal instruction, arranged in advance by her father's correspondence with the palace, and she stood in her assigned place and observed the room with the thoroughness of someone who had been observing rooms for 10 years without the requirement to participate in them. The women around her were assessing each other with the focused peripheral attention of people who understood they were in competition without anyone having said so explicitly. She received several glances, her simple dress, her stillness, the card the steward had produced for her, and she watched the assessments being made and filed and revised, all without engaging with any of them, which she was entirely accustomed to. She was not thinking about the assessments. She was thinking about him. He entered the hall from the eastern door, not the ceremonial entrance she had been told to expect. This was itself information. A man who used side doors in his own palace was a man who was interested in arriving without the arrangements that main entrances required. He had 3 attendants, rather than the standard 12. He was wearing working clothes under a formal coat that had the look of something added recently rather than worn all day. He was different from the prince she had felt the bond with 10 years ago. Older, obviously, but differently. The decade had done something to his face that went beyond aging, had settled something that had been unresolved in the younger version, had given his features the quality of a person who has made important decisions and is living comfortably inside them. He was broad through the shoulders and moved like someone who kept himself physically capable as a practical matter rather than a ceremonial one. His dark eyes were the same. She had remembered them correctly. He moved through the room. She tracked him with the peripheral attention she had perfected over 10 years, keeping her gaze forward and her expression neutral, watching him work the left side of the room with focused attention, genuinely looking at each woman, she noted. Genuinely stopping, not scanning. The quality of his attention was the same as it had been in the border court gathering. She was cataloging this with the careful distance of someone taking notes on a subject. He was halfway down the right side when she felt the bond move, not gradually, the way she had felt it stir in the carriage. All at once, the way it had in the border court gathering 10 years ago. A bell struck. A key turned. A certainty arriving without apology. She kept her face forward. She kept her breathing even. She kept every muscle in her body in the arrangement of someone standing calmly in a row. He stopped. She knew he had stopped before she let herself register it, because his footsteps had been an irregular rhythm across the hall floor, and the rhythm had ceased. She did not look toward him. She looked forward. She felt him looking at her. She had been looked at for 10 years. She was accustomed to the experience of being looked at and remaining still. She found now that this particular looking had a different quality. Not the assessing glance of someone categorizing her impairment, not the curious sidelong look of someone trying to understand the written card procedure, but something more direct and more specific. The look of someone who has recognized something. Her heartbeat was entirely undignified. He moved on. She heard the footsteps resume. She breathed. He withdrew with his attendants after 20 minutes, and the room shifted from held stillness to released chatter, women turning to each other with the particular relief of tension broken. Sarah stood in the change of energy and stayed with her own stillness, which was its own kind of relief. The privacy of deafness, performed or genuine, was that the social obligation to participate in released tension did not apply to her. The steward appeared at her elbow with another written card. His Majesty requests the written company of Lady Sarah of House Callum at her earliest convenience. She read the card. She looked at the steward with the steady gray eyes that gave nothing away. She picked up her small case and followed him. The private meeting room was a working room like all his rooms, she suspected. Maps on the table, documents in organized stacks, a window overlooking the inner courtyard rather than the decorative garden, the window of someone who wanted to see what was actually happening rather than what was designed to be seen. She sat in the chair the steward indicated. The steward withdrew. The door closed. She arranged herself. This was the technical term she used internally for the process of settling into the performance, composure, blankness, the patient attentiveness of someone waiting to receive communication through a medium other than sound. She had done it 10,000 times. She did it now with the specific deliberateness of someone who understood that the next few minutes required her best work. The door opened. He came in alone, which was her first piece of new information. No attendants, no scribe, no intermediary. He sat across from her at the table and he looked at her, and she looked back at him with the performance of mild interested attention that she gave authority figures, and they regarded each other across the table. He said nothing. She waited, arranging her expression into the patient expectancy of someone waiting for written communication to be produced. He still said nothing. She let the moment extend the appropriate length of time, and then, with the careful mime of someone who has done this 1,000 times, she touched her ear lightly and then opened her hands in the small gesture that meant, "I cannot hear you." "Please write." He looked at her hands. He looked at her face, he said, in a voice that was exactly as she remembered it. Low, direct, with the specific quality of someone who does not waste words, and therefore the words they use carry more weight. He said, "I know." She kept her expression still. She kept her hands open in the gesture. She let her eyes hold the mild, expectant blankness. He leaned forward slightly. His dark eyes were entirely steady. "I know you can hear me," he said. "I have known since you walked into the receiving hall." The silence in the room became something she could measure in her own heartbeat. She counted 4 of them, maintaining the expression, buying time that she was aware she did not actually have. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at him. She said nothing. She had said nothing to another person in 10 years that required her own voice rather than written words or hand language. And she found now that the nothing felt different when she was choosing it in full awareness that the choice had already been understood. "How?" she said. Her voice was lower than she remembered it, rougher from disuse, the word coming out with the specific flatness of someone who has not spoken aloud in a very long time. She had spoken to herself sometimes, quietly, alone in her rooms, to maintain the capability. But this was different. He did not look surprised that she had spoken. He looked as if he had been waiting. "The way you listen," he said simply. "There is a quality to how you attend to a room when you think no one is watching you." He paused. "You track sounds, small sounds, a door catching, a whisper from the other side of a hall. Your eyes don't move toward the sound, but your body registers it." He held her gaze. "I have been watching rooms for 11 years. I know the difference between someone who cannot hear and someone who has learned not to show that they can." She looked at him. Her expression was no longer the performance. It was her actual face, and it was very still. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since the receiving hall," he said. "When the steward dropped his card portfolio behind you and you held your stillness for exactly half a second too long before the non-reaction." She absorbed this. "You didn't say anything," she said. "No. Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "Because I wanted to understand why first," he said. "Before I made it about what I knew." She sat across from him in the working room with the maps on the walls and felt something she had not felt in 10 years. The specific exposure of being seen through something she had built to be opaque, and the strange discovery that the exposure, arriving in this particular way from this particular person, did not feel like danger. She told him about the border court gathering, and the moment with the drinks tray and the bond arriving without warning. She told him about the 2 months of thinking and the mating law research, and the decision made at 18 with the thoroughness of someone who understood what she was committing to. She told him the full logic of it, the political calculations, the observed lives of royal mates, the specific texture of a future she had looked at clearly and found unacceptable. She told him all of it in a voice that grew steadier as it went, muscle memory of language returning with use, the specific relief of speaking out loud to someone who was listening, which was something she had not known she missed until it was happening. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He said, "You watched me." "At the border gathering." She looked at him. "Yes. And you knew who I was. Within the week." He was quiet. His expression was doing something she could not yet read. He was, she suspected, a man whose face was as carefully managed as hers, though for different reasons. "And you chose this," he said. 10 years. "Yes." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "Did it work?" She understood what he was asking. She held his gaze. "No," she said. He did not respond to that immediately. He had the quality, she was discovering, of someone who treated significant things as significant, who did not rush past a moment that required sitting in, who allowed silences to be what they were rather than filling them with the first available words. She had known this about him in the abstract, from a decade of careful observation. She was knowing it now in the specific, which was different. He rose from his chair and moved to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking at the inner courtyard below, his hands clasped behind him, and she watched his back and waited. He said, still looking at the courtyard, "When I was at the border gathering 10 years ago, I identified the bond within the first hour." She went still. "I identified it, and I spent the remainder of the evening determining who you were," he said. "By the end of the night, I knew your name and your house and your father's political positions." He paused. "I was 20, and I had been managing the border survey operation for 3 months, and I understood, the way you understood, what a bond meant in terms of the life it implied. I understood what it would mean to bring someone into the specific circumstances I was navigating." He turned from the window. "I made a decision not to approach." She looked at him. "You let me believe I had." She stopped. "That my decision was unilateral," he said. "Yes, He held her gaze. I was not certain it was the right decision. I have thought about it a great many times in the years since. She sat with this. The architecture of the last 10 years was rearranging itself around this information, and she was letting it rearrange, not fighting the process, just following the new shape. You were protecting me, she said. She said it without inflection, testing it as a statement. I was protecting you from a situation you had no reason to want, he said. And I was protecting myself from the knowledge that someone had been pulled into my circumstances without choosing it. He paused. I was not certain those were good enough reasons. I am still not certain. She looked at him across the working room. Why did you summon everyone now? She said. If you have been managing this for 10 years. He was quiet for a moment. Because I am a king, and I have been a king for 3 years, and I am 30 years old, he said. And the kingdom requires a queen, not because I am unable to govern without one, but because there are specific functions that require it, and I have been delaying those functions for reasons that are not entirely about governance. She heard the precision in this, the specific way he had chosen the words that were true, without being more than she had earned the right to hear yet. You were waiting, she said. He looked at her. I sent the summons to every eligible house in Valdenmoor, he said. I did not send it specifically to House Callum. She understood the distinction. He had not manufactured the situation. He had simply not excluded it. And now, she said. He crossed back to the table and sat down. He looked at her with the dark eyes that had been the same for 10 years, and that she had been careful not to look at too directly in memory for exactly that reason. Now, he said, we have a conversation that is 10 years overdue, and at the end of it we each decide what we want to do. She looked at him steadily. And if what I decide is that I would like to leave. He held her gaze. Then, I will give you every formal courtesy and make certain your house suffers no political consequence. He paused. But I want to ask you something first. She nodded. Why did you come? He said. You had 4 weeks after the summons. You have spent 10 years building a situation that made this entirely avoidable. You are careful and thorough, and you do not do things without reason. She looked at him. The question was the same one she had been avoiding asking herself for 4 weeks, and she found, sitting across from him in the working room with the performance no longer required, that she was done avoiding it. Because I wanted to see, she said quietly, whether the reason I stayed away was still true. Whether the life I was protecting myself from was still the one I would have. He was very still. Or whether, she said, I had made a decision at 18 based on 18-year-old information and had been living inside it for 10 years without checking. He looked at her for a long time. And, he said. She held his gaze. The jury is still out, she said. But I am here. She paused. That is more than I was going to do 6 months ago. He nodded. It was a serious nod, not dismissive, not performing lightness, just receiving what she had said and holding it at appropriate weight. Then we have time, he said. Whatever time you need. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the bond between them, 10 years old and patient beyond what either of them had deserved of it, held its note in the space between them without demanding anything. She said, I would like to walk. In the inner courtyard. She paused. And I would like to not perform anything while I do it. He rose from his chair and held the door. They walked in the courtyard in the pale afternoon, and she listened openly to the city sounds beyond the walls for the first time in 10 years in someone else's company, and it felt, unexpectedly and precisely, like breathing after holding her breath for a very long time. The courtyard became their place without either of them deciding it. It was not discussed. It was simply the location they returned to, in the mornings when his council schedule permitted, in the late afternoons when both of them had finished the work that filled their days, once in the early evening when she had been in the library, and he had found her there and suggested air, and they had walked without planning to until they were in the courtyard, and had stayed until the stars came out. She spoke to him differently than she had spoken to anyone in 10 years, not with her full voice, that returned incrementally, the roughness smoothing out as the days passed, her ear for her own speech gradually recalibrating, but with the specific quality of speech that was entirely honest, unmanaged, without the performed blankness or the careful delays she had used in every interaction for a decade. It was strange, not uncomfortable. Strange in the way of things that are unfamiliar rather than wrong. He matched her. She had expected him to be careful with her, to approach the revealed deception with the diplomatic management of a man trained to navigate sensitive situations. He was not careful in that way. He was direct, asking real questions and expecting real answers, offering real information about himself in return without performing openness. He treated the 10-year pretense as a fact about the past rather than an ongoing condition, which was, she recognized, precisely the right way to treat it, and also not the obvious choice. She told him about the estate on the 5th morning. They were walking the southern colonnade, which had become a variation on their usual route, and she told him about the system she had built, the steward, the written notes, the strategic management of her father's belief in her impairment, the 17 different workarounds she had devised over the years to manage an estate and a household, and 2 full-time staff while maintaining the performance. She told it clinically, because that was how she held most things, and she watched him listen with the focused attention that was always real. When she finished, he said, "How many people know?" 3, she said. "The steward, my personal maid, and a land surveyor I hired in the 4th year who figured it out himself and who I paid generously to be discreet." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father still believes it." Yes, she waited for the judgment in this. She had known it would arrive eventually, the specific moral weight of a decade of sustained deception directed at her own parent, which she was not without feelings about, and which she had organized those feelings around very carefully over the years. He said, "Was he ever going to let you choose?" She looked at the colonnade stones. "No," she said. "Not in any meaningful way. He would have given me options. He would have involved me in the process. He is not a bad man." She paused. "But the outcome was not going to be genuinely mine." He nodded. He said nothing further about her father. He moved the conversation forward, which she registered and filed as information about how he handled things he understood did not require his addition. On the 8th day, she asked him about the border survey. They were in the courtyard at mid-morning, sitting on the low stone bench that had become habitual, and she asked him what the survey had found. The real survey, the classified findings, the ones that had not made it into the official reports she had read through her father's correspondence. He looked at her for a moment. "How much of my correspondence have you read?" She met his eyes. "The parts your couriers left unattended at your father's border outposts," she said, "in the 3rd year of the survey." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Eastern Ridge fortifications were inadequately manned. We had a 17% gap in coverage that the official reports characterized as a patrol scheduling issue." "Not a scheduling issue," she said. "No. A funding issue that no one wanted to put in writing." She nodded. "I thought so. The patrol logs didn't match the fortification maps." He stared at her. "You cross-referenced the patrol logs with the fortification maps." "I had time," she said. 10 years is a long time to gather information when no one thinks you are gathering it." He sat with this for a moment. Then, slowly, he said, "What else do you know?" She told him. She told him about the 3 trade route vulnerabilities she had identified through comparative analysis of dispatch patterns, the water rights dispute in the Northern Territories that the official record showed as resolved and her own reading suggested was not. The specific political allegiance calculation of 4 Western houses that she had worked out through careful observation of which couriers they shared and which they kept separate. He listened to all of it. When she finished, the courtyard was very quiet. "You have been," he said slowly, "conducting your own intelligence operation for 10 years. "I have been paying attention," she said. "I had more capacity for it than most people assumed." He looked at her with an expression she was learning, not the diplomatic openness of a man performing receptiveness, but the specific, focused attention of someone encountering something that genuinely interests them. "This information," he said, "about the Eastern Ridge, the water rights dispute, the Western House allegiances." He paused. "This is more accurate than what my own intelligence officers have provided." She held his gaze. "I imagine so," she said. "I had access to corridors they did not." He was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at her the way she had watched him look at complex maps, finding the edges, understanding the shape, beginning to see what it meant in the larger configuration. "Sira," he said, her name in his voice for the first time, direct and without ceremony. "Yes, I want to ask you something, and I want you to give me the honest answer rather than the managed one." She nodded. "Are you here?" he said, "because of the bond? Or because you want to be here?" She held his gaze. She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "Both," she said. "The bond is real, and I am not pretending it is not." She paused. "But the bond is not why I stayed. I stayed because you found out in the first hour and you did not use it." She met his eyes. "That told me something about you that the bond cannot tell me, and I want to know more of those things." He looked at her for a long time. "So do I," he said. "About you." They sat in the courtyard in the late morning sun, and the bond between them moved with the quiet patience of something that has waited 10 years and has learned that patience is its own kind of answer. She told her father on the 12th day. She had been composing the approach for most of the time since her arrival, the way she composed all difficult things, methodically, accounting for variables, identifying the specific words that would carry the necessary information without excess. She wrote him a letter first, which was the communication form he was most accustomed to receiving from her, and she sat with the letter for a day, and then she asked for transport to the guest quarters, where her father had been installed for the duration of the selection proceedings. She walked into his sitting room, and she sat across from him, and she said, in her own voice, directly and without preamble, "I have to tell you something that will be difficult to hear." Her father's face went through several things in rapid succession. She watched them with the practiced attention she had given his face for 28 years, shock first, at the voice, the real voice speaking clearly and without the trained flatness, and then a dawning comprehension that arrived slowly and changed his expression into something older and more pained than she had expected. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "How long?" 10 years, she said. His face absorbed this. He was a careful man, her father, not given to displays, and she watched him hold the information and work with it in the way he worked with difficult political situations, organizing it, understanding it, moving toward the practical implications. "Why?" he said. She told him. Not all of it, not the bond, not Aldrich, not the specific legal research. She told him the part that was about him, which was the part he had a right to hear. She told him that she had understood at 18 that she was being moved toward a future that was not going to be hers to choose, and that she had found a way to stop that movement, and that she was sorry for the deception and not sorry for the protection of herself that had required it, and that she was telling him now because she was done with deception as a management tool, and because he deserved to know the truth from her directly, rather than from circumstances. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I would have listened," he said, "if you had told me." She looked at him with the clear eyes that did not perform and did not manage. "Father," she said gently, "you would have tried." He looked at her. He understood the distinction. She watched him understand it, watched it cost him something, watched him receive the cost with the dignity of a man who is not accustomed to recognizing his own blind spots and is trying to do it now anyway. "The king," he said finally. "He knows." "Yes." He was quiet. Then, very quietly, "Is the bond real?" "Yes." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had shifted in his expression, the careful political man making room for something more personal and more complicated. "Are you all right?" he said. And she understood he was asking about more than the moment. "Yes," she said. She meant it. "I am better than I have been in 10 years. He nodded. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair briefly, and she let him, and neither of them spoke for a while. She returned to her suite in the palace and sat in the window and felt the particular exhaustion of having told the truth after a long time of not telling it. Not bad exhaustion, but the specific heavy tiredness of someone who has been carrying something and has set it down, and whose body is registering the absence of the weight. He appeared at her door an hour later. She had not expected him. He did not send word in advance. She was learning, when he came to find her, this was apparently also a characteristic, arriving without arrangement, as if the arrangement would change something about the arrival that he preferred not to change. She opened the door and he looked at her face, which she was not managing, and he said, "How did it go?" She stepped back to let him in. She sat in the window chair, and he took the chair across from her, as he always did, both of them in their accustomed positions. And she told him about her father. He listened to all of it. When she was done, he said, "You spoke to him directly." "Yes." "In your own voice?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. His expression was doing the thing she had been cataloging, the specific quality of feeling something and choosing not to diminish it by naming it too quickly. That was, he said carefully, not a small thing to do. "No," she agreed. "How do you feel?" She looked out the window at the courtyard below. "Strange," she said, "like a room with all the furniture moved. The same room, but you have to relearn where everything is." He nodded. He understood this from the inside, she was coming to believe, the specific experience of a life that requires constant management producing a person who is very competent and very alone with the competence. They sat in the window light without speaking for a while. She did not perform the silence, and he did not fill it, and it was, she thought, the most honest hour she had spent in the company of another person in 10 years. After a while, he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. "The intelligence you gave me," he said, "about the Eastern Ridge and the water rights and the Western houses, I took it to my head of intelligence this morning." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "He said my information was significantly more specific and significantly more accurate than anything his office had produced on the same subjects in the past 18 months. His expression was wry, but not entirely wry. He was also considerably irritated about it, which I found satisfying." She almost smiled. "What did you do with the irritation?" "I suggested he consider the possibility that his information-gathering methods had a systematic blind spot," he said, "and that he might benefit from a consultative relationship with someone who does not have that blind spot." She looked at him steadily. "You're offering me a role." "I'm telling you what I told my intelligence head," he said. "The offer, if there is one, depends on a number of things we haven't finished discussing yet." She held his gaze. She understood his precision. He was not using the information or the intelligence work or the bond to move her toward a conclusion. He was laying out facts and letting her work with them. It was, she thought, Exactly the thing that a man who had not approached her 10 years ago because he did not want her moved without choosing would do. She looked at him in the window light. "Tell me," she said, "what kind of queen you actually need. Not the formal version, the real one." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her. He talked for an hour. She listened the way she had always listened, completely, without performance, tracking every layer of what was being said and what was being said beneath it. He talked about the kingdom with the specific intimacy of a man who had been responsible for something large and complex for 3 years and had found very few people with whom he could discuss it honestly. He talked about the water rights dispute in the Northern Territories and confirmed her analysis and added 3 dimensions she had not had access to. He talked about the intelligence office's systematic over-reliance on social networks that did not include women, servants, tradespeople, or anyone operating outside the formal political structures, which created predictable gaps that had cost the kingdom in specific measurable ways. He talked about a trade negotiation with the southern kingdoms that was being conducted through a cultural framework the southern delegation did not actually hold, which meant every agreement reached was being understood differently by both parties and would collapse at implementation. He talked and she asked questions and he answered them and revised his thinking twice in response to her questions, and she revised hers once in response to his revisions, and by the end of the hour they had been talking to each other the way, she thought, 2 people talk when they have been waiting a long time for someone whose mind works in a compatible way. She said, "The Southern trade negotiation. Is it still active?" "It reconvenes in 3 weeks," he said. She thought about what she knew about the Southern cultural framework, which was specific and based on correspondence she had read and a memoir she had found in her father's library and a pattern she had noticed in the terms they consistently pushed for across 4 different documented negotiations. "The framing is wrong," she said. "They're not negotiating for economic advantage. They're negotiating for what they call clean obligation, a trade relationship that doesn't imply debt or dependence in either direction. Their language about terms that look like poor economic choices for them is actually signaling that those terms feel conceptually clean to them." He was very still. "How do you know this?" She explained the memoir and the correspondence pattern, and the specific word choices that repeated across the documented negotiations, which she had cross-referenced in the library in her second week at the palace. He listened with the focused attention of someone who was also doing rapid calculations. He said, "If we restructure the framing around mutual sufficiency rather than mutual advantage, the terms they've been resisting become acceptable," she said, "and the terms we've been conceding become unnecessary." He looked at her across the sitting room. She met his gaze. He said, "I want to introduce you to my trade negotiation team." She raised an eyebrow. "Before we have finished determining what we are," he held her gaze. "I want to introduce you to my trade negotiation team," he said again, and the repetition was deliberate, which she understood meant, because this is not contingent on the other thing, this is separate from the other thing. This is yours regardless of the other thing. She looked at him. She thought about 18-year-old Sarah reading mating law and pressing her fingers into her ear in a cold room and making a decision that had cost her 10 years of silence. She thought about 28-year-old Sarah sitting across from the man she had made that decision about and finding that the cost was still real, and also that the decision, in this specific moment, had led somewhere she had not calculated at 18. She said, "The bond. I would like to talk about it directly." He nodded. "Yes, I have been managing it for 10 years, she said. "I know how it feels to hold it at a distance." She paused. "I do not know how it feels to stop holding it at a distance." She met his eyes. "I am not afraid of it." "I want you to know that." "I am." She searched for the precise word. "I am unfamiliar with it." "The unmanaged version." He was quiet for a moment. His expression was open in the way she had learned to recognize, not performed openness, but the real kind, which on his face was a specific quality of attention without armor. "I have been managing it too," he said, "at a different distance, for the same length of time." He paused. "I do not know what it feels like unmanaged either." She looked at him. "We are both," she said, "quite inexperienced at this particular thing." "For very capable people," he agreed, and the wryness in his voice was entirely genuine and also entirely fond, and she felt the bond respond to the fondness with the specific movement of something that has been patient and is now being met. She said, "I would like to stop managing it." He looked at her. "Not immediately," she said. "I don't do things immediately." She paused. "But I would like to move toward stopping, if you are willing to do the same." He held her gaze for a long time. "Yes," he said. He said it the way he said things he meant, without embellishment, without ceremony, exactly and precisely, and as if the precision were the point. She nodded. Good. She looked out the window at the courtyard below, where they had been walking for 2 weeks, and then she looked back at him, and she said, "Then we should probably learn each other's names properly." He looked at her. "You know my name. Your formal name," she said. "I know it from the documents." She paused. "I mean the one people who know you actually use." He was quiet for a moment. His expression shifted into something younger and slightly self-conscious that she had not seen before. "Aldrich," he said. "Just Aldrich." She said it. Just that, Aldrich. The same word in her own voice, trying the shape of it as if taking something new into her hands and feeling its weight. He said, "Sarah." She looked at him. Just that, him saying her name, not as a formal address, not as the label on a document, but as if it were a word he had been turning over for 10 years and was finally saying aloud. She found the room considerably warmer than it had been a moment ago. The Southern trade negotiation reconvened in 18 days rather than 3 weeks. She had drafted the new framing document in 4 days, working in the library with the focused efficiency she brought to things she understood, cross-referencing the documentary evidence she had compiled with the trade records Aldrich had given her access to, and 3 additional sources she had requested and received without needing to explain the request. He had apparently instructed his staff to provide whatever she asked for, which she had discovered when her 3rd request arrived within the hour and without the usual procedural delay. She had not commented on this. She had used the resources. The framing document was 6 pages rather than the usual 40. She had written it in the Southern Diplomatic Register rather than the Valdenmoor formal style, which required careful calibration and 2 revisions, and she had structured it around the clean obligation concept without naming the concept, allowing the Southern delegation to arrive at the recognition themselves, which was considerably more effective than being told. He had read the draft in 1 sitting, which she could tell because he arrived at the library 30 minutes after she sent it with the document in his hand and the expression of someone who has read something that has moved the furniture of their understanding. "This will work," he said. "Yes," she said. He sat across from her at the library table. "His trade minister is going to want to know where this came from." "You can tell him," she said. He looked at her. "We haven't announced anything." She met his gaze. "I'm not suggesting you announce anything. I'm suggesting you tell your trade minister that a woman who spent 10 years listening to conversations she was not supposed to be part of has useful information about how people actually communicate, as opposed to how they officially communicate." She paused. "The source is the point. It tells him something about the methodology he should be applying." He looked at her for a long moment. "You want him to change how his office works. I want the kingdom to function better," she said. "The methodology change follows from that." He was quiet. Then he said, with the specific tone she was learning to recognize as his version of enormous respect delivered in a register that did not perform it. All right. The negotiation team was assembled the following morning in the strategy room, and she sat at the end of the table and explained her analysis in the direct, unhurried way she explained everything, and the ministers listened with varying degrees of initial skepticism that moved, as the explanation progressed and the evidence accumulated, toward the focused attention of people who are recognizing a better tool. At the end, Aldrich said, "We will adopt the Lady Sarah's framing for the reconvened session." She watched the ministers absorb this, not just the decision but the specific form of it, the attribution, the directness. She watched them recalibrate. She was becoming visible. This was the thing she was finding she had not fully accounted for in the years of managing her invisibility. She had built the deafness to stay out of sight, to stay unclaimed, to prevent herself from being moved by forces larger than her own choosing. She had not fully thought through what it would mean to be visible, specifically, to have her name said in rooms and her analysis attributed, and her presence in the strategy room a fact rather than an anomaly. She thought about it in the evenings in the courtyard with Aldrich. She told him about it one evening directly, as she had learned to tell him most things without managing the telling. "I don't know how to be seen," she said. "I know how to observe. Being observed is different." He was sitting beside her on the stone bench, their shoulders close, and he looked at her with the expression that was his version of complete attention. "I know," he said. He said it with the specific quality of someone who is not offering comfort but recognition. "I have been managing the inverse of this for 11 years. He paused. "Being seen constantly and learning to keep myself invisible inside it." She looked at him. "The king who uses side doors. The king who uses side doors," he agreed, "and arrives without announcement when he wants to find something real." She understood this. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned over information, looking at its shape, finding its implications. "We are," she said, "somewhat complementary problems." His expression shifted into the one she was collecting, the very specific warmth he produced when she said something that arrived exactly right. "Yes," he said. "We are." She said, "I'm going to stop thinking of the visibility as a risk." He looked at her. "Just like that?" She considered this. "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks," she said. "I am telling you the conclusion. The process is my own." He smiled. The full one, real and unhurried. She was finding she could look at it directly now without reorganizing her expression. She said, "Aldrich." He looked at her. "I want to accept the bond," she said, "not as a political decision and not as a response to the summons and not because the management of it has become unsustainable." She held his gaze. "Because I want to. The specific wanting is mine." The courtyard was very quiet. He looked at her for a long time with an expression she could now read fully. It was the look of a man receiving something he has held himself carefully away from wanting, because the wanting had seemed too much like entitlement, and who is now being given permission to have the wanting be real. He said her name. "Just that." She said, "Yes." He took her hand in the courtyard in the late evening, and she turned her face toward him and let him look at it. All of it. The face she had spent 10 years managing, the expression she was not arranging, and he looked at it the way he had looked at the complex maps, finding the shape, understanding it, choosing it. He kissed her, there in the courtyard, unhurried and completely real, and the bond between them completed the way it had always been going to, not with ceremony or arrangement but in the ordinary evening air, between two people who had each, in their own way, found the courage to stop managing and start arriving. She told the court herself. She had discussed this with him and he had offered to make the announcement formally, which was the conventional approach, and she had said she preferred to do it herself, which he had received with the nod that meant he understood and agreed and would not argue. She stood in the strategy room with the trade ministers and the senior counsel and the court advisors who had been gradually appearing at meetings she attended, and she said, "Without preamble and without performance, I should tell you directly that I have been able to hear throughout my life." She paused. "I made a decision at 18 to conceal this for reasons that were my own. I am telling you now because I intend to be visible in this court, and deception is incompatible with that intention." The room was very quiet. She watched the faces. She had spent 10 years reading faces, and she could follow the responses clearly: shock, recalculation, the specific quality of attention that follows unexpected information, and in several faces something she had not entirely expected, a kind of recognition, the response of people who had also navigated systems by finding their edges and working around them. Aldrich said nothing. He sat at the head of the table and watched her with the expression she had come to think of as his real face, and did not intervene. The trade minister, who had been working with her framing document for 2 weeks, said, "The Southern analysis." "Did that come from—" "Yes," she said. "From listening in rooms I was not supposed to be listening in." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the blunt honesty she had been told was characteristic of him, "I don't care how it was gathered. It's the most accurate intelligence we've had in 3 years." Several other faces in the room shifted toward the same position. She said, "I want to work with your intelligence office. Formally, I want to redesign the methodology to address the structural blind spots in the current approach." The intelligence head, who was also present and who she suspected had been expecting something like this since Aldrich had raised the issue with him, said that would be a significant restructuring. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze with the steady gray eyes that did not perform and did not manage. "Significant restructuring," he said again, more slowly. "And then, when would you like to begin?" She almost smiled. She worked for 3 weeks before the formal betrothal announcement. She worked with the intelligence office on the methodology redesign. She completed the trade negotiation framing which was used in the reconvened session and produced a preliminary agreement that the trade minister described as the most balanced outcome in a decade. And she began the water rights analysis for the Northern Territories which she had identified as incorrectly resolved, and which, upon formal review, turned out to be exactly as incorrectly resolved as her reading had suggested. She worked hard. She had always worked hard. The difference now was complete. Not managing around a performance, not building workarounds for a constructed limitation, not directing her intelligence through the narrow channels that invisibility permitted. Just working, directly, with the full capacity of what she had always been, and the full authority of what she was becoming. He worked beside her when their schedules aligned, and across the palace when they did not, and found her in the evenings in the courtyard or the library or the strategy room, depending on where the day had left her, and they talked about the work and talked about other things, and built the particular easy companionship of 2 people who have found each other's thinking genuinely comfortable to be near. She realized on a Tuesday in the 5th week, happy. She sat with this the way she sat with significant information, carefully, making sure she understood its shape correctly. She had been satisfied before, in the 10 years, in specific moments of successful management or work well done. She had not been happy the way she was happy now, which was a different thing, fuller and less localized, present not in moments but as a quality of her days. She told him this in the courtyard that evening. He was quiet for a moment after she said it. Then he said, "I know." She looked at him. "I can tell," he said. His voice was low and entirely honest. "The way you move in rooms has changed." She considered this. "How?" "Like someone who isn't tracking the exits," he said. She looked at the courtyard walls and thought about this. She had been tracking exits for 10 years. She had become so fluent in it that she had stopped noticing she was doing it, the same way she had stopped noticing most of the performance, It had simply become the texture of how she moved through the world. She was not tracking exits now. She was sitting in a courtyard in the evening with a man who had known her secret since the first hour and had waited for her to tell it herself, and she was not tracking anything except the specific warmth of his presence beside her and the specific quality of a day that had been entirely genuinely hers. She leaned against him slightly. He put his arm around her without comment, without performance, just the easy adjustment of someone making room. They sat in the courtyard as the evening came fully down and the palace settled into its nighttime sounds, and she listened to all of it openly, without management, without arrangement, just the world sounding itself around her the way it had been sounding for 10 years while she pretended otherwise. She had spent 10 years listening to everything and pretending to hear nothing. She was done pretending. The formal betrothal was announced on a Friday morning in the Great Hall. She had attended 2 previous Great Hall gatherings since her arrival, the initial receiving line and a formal court assembly that she had navigated with the composure of someone who had been in public for 10 years and knew how to hold a room. This was different. This was the room being held for her. She stood beside Aldrich in the Great Hall and listened to the formal declaration with the open, unhurried attention she brought to everything now, and she looked at the court, all the faces, the various calculations and recalibrations, the range of responses from warmly accepting to carefully neutral to 1 or 2 that were still working through the revelation of the previous weeks, and she met each face with the steadiness she had always had, which felt different now than it had felt in the receiving line. There she had been using her steadiness as a shield. Here she was simply being steady. He spoke the formal words clearly and without ceremony beyond what the occasion required, and she received them the same way, and the hall responded with the formal applause of a court performing its function, and she thought about the 18-year-old who had stood in her cold room with a decision and wondered what that girl would make of this specific moment. She thought the girl would be surprised. She also thought the girl would recognize it as the direction she had been moving in, even when the movement had looked like standing still. After the formal proceedings withdrew into the smaller rooms that followed Great Hall announcements, the conversations, the congratulations, the inevitable political adjustments being made, he found her by the eastern window where she had stepped briefly for air. He came to stand beside her without announcing himself, as was his way, and they looked out at the inner courtyard below together. "How are you?" he said. She thought about it. "Present," she said. She paused. "That is the most accurate word." He nodded. He understood what it meant, not just the moment but the specific quality of presence she was describing, the experience of being in a room without part of herself operating at remove. She said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her. "When I was 18, she said, and I made the decision. I told myself it was entirely rational, that I had assessed the situation accurately and found a logical solution." She paused. "I understood later that there was also fear in it, not of you specifically, of being moved." He was quiet. "I am still not good at being moved," she said. "I want you to know that. It is a thing I am working on, and I expect I will be working on it for some time." He looked at her with the specific warmth she had been collecting for weeks, the warmth that arrived in his expression when she said something exactly as it was. "I know," he said. He said it with the patience of someone who means it as a long-term commitment rather than a present observation. She nodded. She looked out at the courtyard. She said, "I am glad the bond was with you specifically." He was still. "Not because of the governance," she said. "Not because of the intelligence methodology or the trade negotiation or the access to the library." She turned to look at him. "Because you knew in the first hour and you waited. Because you made the same decision I made at 18 from the same instinct, and you have been honest about it. Because you treat what I know as information rather than anomaly." She paused. "Because you arrived at my door without announcement when you wanted to find something real." He looked at her for a long time. The great hall sounds continued behind them, and the courtyard was quiet below, and the morning light was ordinary and clear. He said, "I have spent 11 years being responsible for 10,000 people and finding it entirely possible to be alone inside that responsibility." He held her gaze. "I am not alone in the same way anymore." She understood this from the inside. The specific experience of competence that cannot be shared because there is no one at the right altitude to share it with, and the particular new quality of no longer being in that specific aloneness. "No," she said. "Neither am I." They stood at the eastern window in the ordinary morning light, not performing and not managing, just present in the specific fullness of two people who have each, in their own long, complicated way, found the person whose company makes the work better, and the silence comfortable, and the room feel like something other than a space to be navigated. She said, "I want to go to the Northern Territories myself, for the water rights dispute." He looked at her. "I know the on-the-ground situation better than the official reports," she said, "and the methodology for a direct assessment would be more efficient than another round of correspondence analysis." He said, "When?" "After the formal bonding ceremony," she said. She paused. "I don't want to be in the Northern Territories when the bonding ceremony happens." He almost smiled. "No." He agreed. She looked at the courtyard. "The survey will take 3 weeks." She glanced at him. "You could come. There are Eastern Ridge installations in the same territory." He said, "I will arrange the Eastern Ridge review." She nodded. She looked back at the courtyard. "Aldrich," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for the first hour." She met his eyes. For knowing and waiting, he held her gaze with the expression that was entirely his, open, unhurried, real. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, when you had every reason to stay away." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the bond between them, 10 years old and patient and finally arrived at its own completion, held the morning quietly between them. She had spent 10 years listening to everything and pretending to hear nothing. She had spent 10 years at the edge of a life she had decided she did not want, only to discover that the deciding had led her here, to this window, to this morning, to this man who had known her secret in the first hour and had given her the time to tell it herself. She was done with the pretending. She was done with the managing and the tracking and the careful arrangement of herself for rooms that did not know she was fully present in them. She was present now. Fully, entirely, in the specific morning light of a court that knew her name and her voice and the 10 years she had spent in necessary silence, and the life she was beginning, visible and chosen and entirely her own. The bond had waited 10 years. She had made it wait. She was grateful for it now, not the waiting, but what the waiting had taught her about herself, that she was not someone who could be moved without choosing, that the choosing, when it came, would be real. She had chosen. She was staying. The bonding ceremony was held on a Wednesday. She had not wanted elaborate ceremony, and he had not pushed for it. Which meant they had arrived at a version that was formally sufficient without being performative, the appropriate witnesses, the appropriate words, the appropriate setting in the smaller royal chapel rather than the great hall, which was a decision she had made, and which he had received with the nod that was his agreement. She wore practical clothes because she wore practical clothes. She had conceded to a formal version of practical, a deep gray gown that was well cut and unornamented, chosen because it would not restrict her movement, and because she did not see the point of wearing something she would not be able to think clearly in. Her household staff had offered alternatives. She had thanked them and dressed herself. He was already in the chapel when she arrived. He was wearing dark formal clothes that were also well cut and also not excessive, and she noted this with the specific register of someone who had learned to read the choices people made in their presentation and what those choices meant about how they thought. He had chosen what she had chosen, independently, which told her something she already knew, but was pleased to confirm. He looked at her when she came in. She looked at him. They had been in this specific configuration many times, facing each other, direct eye contact, no performance from either of them, and it had never stopped being clarifying. She thought it probably never would. Some people produced clarity and some produced noise, and she had found, at 28, that she had an overwhelming preference for the former. The ceremony was short. She had reviewed the words beforehand as she reviewed everything, and she said them in her own voice with the direct quality she brought to things she meant, and he said them the same way, and the witnesses were present and appropriate and unobtrusive, and afterward they walked out of the chapel into the ordinary corridor and continued to the courtyard because that was where they went. They sat on the bench. The bond was different now. Complete rather than contained, the same note but no longer sustained, resolved into something that felt less like maintenance and more like fact. The way breathing feels like fact rather than effort once you stop holding your breath. She said, "That was not what I expected bonding to feel like." He looked at her. "What did you expect?" "Something louder," she said. She paused, something that required more management. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I thought the same thing." She considered this. "We are," she said, "perhaps both less dramatic than the situation warranted." He made a sound that was entirely a laugh. She had heard him laugh 3 times, and this was the 4th, and she was still finding it unexpectedly transformative. He was a different person laughing. Or rather, he was more himself. The person who arrived without announcement and asked real questions and had spent 11 years being responsible for 10,000 people and had been alone inside it until he wasn't. "I think," he said, "we were exactly as dramatic as the situation needed." She thought about this. 10 years of managed silence, a border court gathering with a drinks tray, a receiving hall and a working room, and a stone bench in a courtyard, and a conversation 2 weeks overdue, and 18 days of trade negotiations and water rights analysis, and now a short ceremony and an ordinary corridor and the courtyard in the morning. "Yes," she said, "I think so too." They sat in the courtyard and she listened to the palace around them with the complete openness that was still new enough to feel specific, the distant sounds of the working day, the birds in the garden 2 courts over, the particular quality of wind through the old stone walls that she had been listening to for weeks and now listened to as someone who was staying. She had built her life around the performance of not being here. She was here now, entirely, with no part of herself operating at remove, or tracking exits, or managing the distance between herself and what was actually happening. She had spent 10 years listening to everything and pretending to hear nothing. She was listening now. To all of it, the courtyard and the city beyond its walls, and the bond completed and real and patient, no longer because patience was no longer required, and the man beside her who had known in the first hour and had waited the right amount of time for her to arrive at her own choosing, and the specific morning around them that was ordinary and unremarkable and entirely, completely hers. She put her hand in his. He closed his around it. They sat in the courtyard until the day's work called them back, which it did, because there was a water rights analysis to finalize and an intelligence methodology to continue redesigning, and a Northern Territory survey to plan, and a kingdom to govern together, which was the other part of this. The part she had been afraid of at 18 and which she understood now was not what she had feared at all, not being managed or moved or subsumed, but simply the extension of what they already were, 2 people thinking together about real things, in the specific, comfortable proximity of those who have found each other's company genuinely useful and genuinely good. She was going to be visible in this court, and in this kingdom. She was going to speak in her own voice, and put her name on her analysis, and sit at the table where decisions were made, and bring to those decisions 10 years of listening to everything from a position no one had thought to account for. She was going to be, in the fullest available sense, here. She squeezed his hand once. He looked at her. "There is a meeting with the intelligence head at mid-morning," she said. "He has a proposal for the new field methodology." He said, "I know, I scheduled it." She looked at him. He looked at her. The courtyard held them in the ordinary morning light. She was done pretending. She was, at last and entirely, here,